this short video gonna be kind of the follow-up to two of my articles regarding ports and adapters. So I posted two articles about ports and adapters on Medium. You can find it here. So it contains there are like two articles. First is like some basic introduction, so this is part 1, and here is like part 2. Okay, let's jump into the presentation. When we write our code, it is driven by different sources like external users or some events. We want to write code which is easy to test and have like the good code coverage. We also want to have a code which is well organized. In this way, it is easy to with well organized code, it is easy to find different parts of our application with different responsibilities. So why Hexagon? So usually application have some input and outputs. So there is like left side and right side of our application. Let's say like left side is input and right side is an output. Layered diagrams don't show the whole picture of our application. It's not easy to show or to visualize our application with layered diagrams. It has some drawbacks. Hexagon, in general, I think it's a good tool for software visualization. We can show different aspects of our application. So when we think and talk about Hexagon application, as I mentioned, we have left side of application and right side. So on the left side, we have our drivers of application. So there can be multiple drivers like user interface. It can be queues and messages in that queues which drive our application, our business logic. There can be also like FTP file and multiple others. So those are like primary adapters, drivers of our application. And on the right, we have like the secondary adapters, which it's like output of our application. So based on some business logic, there are some outputs. The most common is like some database operation and database and data within database, but there can be other like email or Kafka messages. So as I mentioned, layers doesn't represent reality well. So it's common to see picture like this, like we have presentation layer, we have business logic and data access, but it doesn't tell you everything. What in the case if we have some external service or we need to integrate with some SMS service? It's hard to present this. It's hard to say from which layer we have this integration, or it's too general sometimes and doesn't tell much. So let's go deep into primary ports and primary adapters, because it's important to understand few definitions. So let's focus right now on the left side of our application. So things which drive our application. So those are like primary ports and primary adapters. So let's start with primary ports. So this is like the first a point for the communication from the outside. They drive our application, request goes through them, and as I said, they reside on the left side of the hexagon. And in the same time, primary adapters, they're used so primary adapters, so primary ports are used by primary adapters, and primary ports are injected into primary adapters. So if we go into specific examples, what is what? Primary adapter in our application can be REST controller. So this is like the input into our application. There is like the HTTP layer, and through this layer the request goes deep into the business logic. It can be also like console interface. There are some commands which user puts into the console and then expects some output. So in this case, in most cases, primary ports are application services. So the term is very broad and can be interpreted differently, but it's like the service which is injected into the controller or console interface and handles inputs from the adapters. So it's kind of the facade for our application. So let's go deeper and try to explain things with real life example. So let's say we have a banking application and we want to create bank account. So there is like the form on the UI where you need to fulfill in order to create like bank account. And on the application side, there is input to our application, which is account controller. So this is primary adapter of our application. So data goes from web browser to our application through HTTP. Account controller handles this data, and then it uses account application service to create account. So we have controller which has account application service injected into it, and it handles account creation through some DTO object, and data goes from the account controller to application services. So once again, we have primary adapter, which is account controller, and we have application service, which is primary port. Okay, so this is a real life example which I described earlier. So first of all, I'm using simple application ports and adapters, which can be found under my GitHub account. So github.com/tomcat/port adapters. Okay, so let's go back and see a primary ports and adapters in action. So let's start from the primary adapter. So primary adapter is, as we described, is an entering point to your application, but it doesn't have any business functionality. It exposes some functionality, but it doesn't have. It injects primary port and triggers functionality on the port. So that's the main function of the adapter. So the data goes through the adapter, but the logic is within the port. So that's the main thing. And in my case, I have simple banking application, and banking account controller, which is primary adapter, and its REST controller. So here you can see that there are a few functionalities like retrieving accounts through the get method. We can create account or we can delete account. What is important here is that all of those functionalities trigger business logic on the port. So banking account service is a port to your application. So this is entering port to the entering point to your application where from which business logic is triggered. Port is always injected into the adapter, and from the adapter the logic is being triggered, like here create functionality on the port or remove functionality on the port. So if we go to the implementation, here you can see that that here there's some logic. Of course, in this case it's very trivial, like triggering some methods on the repository, so saving the data within database, not necessarily database, but it can be database, removing account. So the logic is here, and that's the port. We talked already about left side of the hexagon, so primary ports and adapters, drivers of our application. Now it's time to move into the right side of the hexagon, so secondary adapters and ports, which moves the data and flow outside of our application. So let's start with some basic explanations. Secondary ports, they are driven of our application. So what they are part of our core processes. They belongs to our application. So it is part of our domain business logic. They are used to move the flow and data outside of the application, and as I said on the beginning, they are part of the right side of the hexagon. In the meantime, secondary adapters are nothing more than implementation of the port. So port is an interface which is used by our business logic, while adapter is implementation. Let's go to the real life examples. So examples of the secondary adapters are JPA repository in Java world. It can be external application adapter when you want to connect your application with some other application. The whole implementation, how it is done, the whole communication. So is it HTTP or is it some asynchronous communication? This is an adapter. Email service implementation. So let's say you want to send an email from your application. So the way how it is done, it's the secondary adapter. Ports are nothing more than interfaces for the adapters. So now let's move back to our sample application. We have our account application service, which has a reference to the account repository interface. We don't know what is the implementation. It can be different. It can be account JPA repository, or it can be account in memory implementation. Application service doesn't know what is the underlying implementation. We want to create a new account. So service receives a DTO object. It goes through the port account repository to the real implementation. In this case, it was JPA repository, so account will be created in the database. And as you can see on the right, secondary adapter, once again, it is the real implementation, while port is an abstraction used by our business service, account application service. So to summarize, we have primary ports and adapters and secondary ports and adapters. So primary adapter is the account controller, while primary port in this case is account application service, which is injected into the account controller. On the other side, secondary port is the account repository, which is injected into the account application service, and there is also implementation for this secondary port account repository, which is account JPA repository. Okay, let's jump now to the real life example for secondary port and adapters. So here, let's go back to our main application service or banking account service. So within this class, we trigger our core operations. So we can create banking account, we can remove account, or we can fetch accounts. What you can see here is that this class uses a banking account repository. So in our case, the repository, banking account repository, is port. So our business logic injects interface, and of course under the interface there is the real application, but it knows only about the interface, and it uses dependency injection to inject a concrete implementation. But in this case, interface is a secondary port, and the implementation of this interface, so this is the implementation, it's secondary adapter. So moving back to our examples, let's say we want to send an email outside after the banking account is created. And then we inject repository, we inject interface, which can be email service, and for the development purposes we use some dummy implementation. For the real production scenario we use some real implementation which connects to email service or SMTP server and send email outside. And that's it. With this we have we split our functionality, our definition of functionality from the real implementation. Yeah, and that's it.